In this example, I want to go ahead and give you an introduction to Project 4 and how you might complete Project 4 with regards to the requirements. And you're certainly welcome to expand on kind of any of the things that I'm suggesting here, but this should kind of give you a good kickstart into how do I complete Project 4 and kind of what are the pitfalls that I might run into. Okay, so if I go out to my browser, I have the Jiffy developer API that I've signed into. So I've created an account and I have an API key. And really where I want to go from here is this API Explorer. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the API Explorer. And what it does is it basically says, what am I going to actually do? So I can choose an endpoint that's built by Jiffy. So what I want to do is I want to be able to build a search, and you'll see what happens is it builds the request URL. So this is the URL that we're going to use in our project. Okay, and you'll see inside of here it has my API key embedded, it has the limit embedded, it has the offset embedded, the rating, the language. So really what's going to happen is a user is going to go out to your project and they're going to enter a search term. Okay, so funny dogs, funny cats, something like that. They're going to enter that search term, and you want to take that search term and forward it over to the Jiffy API to see the results that you might get based on that search term. So what this API Explorer is doing is I can type in a search term. So this Q is a parameter. That's really your search term. So if I go into funny dogs, that's going to be my search term, and I want to limit to just 10 results. So you'll notice that the URL is updating kind of in real time. G rating, language of English looks great, and then I can send the request. And you'll see that I get a JSON object back. So I get data. So it's an object that has data, and that data is a collection. A few people have mentioned on Slack, like, hey, I'm trying to use the URL and it's not rendering. Okay, what I mean by that is if I go into the data and just directly click on this URL, so I'm just going to click on that URL, you can see that I'm getting a funny dog. So I'm really just getting the hashtag funny dogs, and I'm getting the Jiffy page. Okay, and that's going to be problematic for me for the project. And the reason I say that is I can't take this page, it's an HTML page, I can't take this page and embed it inside of an image. I actually want these images that are made up for that funny dog search result. Okay, so when I choose my endpoint as search, and why am I not getting that reloaded? So I type in funny dogs, and I send this request and I get my response again. I really don't want this URL. Okay, what I really want is if I drill down, I eventually get into the images of all the funny dogs, and this is an object. And what the object is I have an original, I have downsized large. Okay, so I have all sorts of different images. So I might want a fixed height image. So this one looks fine. So this is a URL, and you can see it's actually a GIF. So this I can actually embed in my image source. So if I click on this, it's still a funny dog, it's still an animated GIF, but it's an actual image. And this is the URL that I want to use. Okay, so that's kind of the starting point of gotchas with Project 4. So if I go back, I know that I'm going to have this endpoint, and for some reason, unless I refresh the page, it doesn't load that request URL. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this request URL, knowing that this Q parameter right here that I have highlighted is something that I have to fill in. So the user is going to type in a search term, so funny cats, funny dogs, etc. They'll type that in, so into a text box, and then I'm going to fill in that parameter value, that Q, which really stands for query, and then I'm also going to update the limit so that I'm only getting 10 results back. So I'm going to go ahead and take this request URL and I'm going to bring it over to my starter code. So the way the starter code works is I have a body, a label, a text box, and a button. So fairly straightforward. I've already wired this up in JavaScript so that I have an event handler that when I do a click, I'm going to have a function called search Jiffy. And I'm going to go ahead and create that function. And I'm using modern functions. And I know that I'm going to have the URL being that URL that I had copied and pasted from that API Explorer. Okay, so this is the URL that I'm going to use. Project 4 requires you to use promises. So there's different ways that we might get our API data. So we might use an XML HTTP request and have a callback, and that callback would be triggered in our onReady state change events. But Project 4 requires you to use promises. So a couple of people have asked about promises where we resolve and reject those promises. The fetch API, so when I use the fetch API to request data from an API, returns a promise. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I need to grab the search term. So if I go back over, the text box is called search term. So I'm going to grab what the user entered. So term equal to document.query selector search term value. So I get the user entered value. I want to embed that in the URL. So what I'm going to do is that's actually going to come first. And then I'm going to embed that in the URL right here where the Q is equal to some value. So I'm just using interpolation here to grab that term and embed it in the URL. And I'm changing my limit to 10. I didn't mention this when we were doing a look at the API Explorer, but the offset would allow you to kind of page through results. So there might be 10,000 results for funny dogs. I want to see the first 10, so the offset is 0, and I'm seeing records 0 through 9. And then I might offset it by 10 to see the next 10, and then offset it by 10 to see the next 10. So that's what this offset is. Okay, if that wasn't clear. Okay, so then what I want to do is I want to get a promise, and the way I'm going to get a promise is I'm going to have a search promise equal to the result of the fetch of that URL. Okay, so fetch is going to return a promise that's either going to resolve or reject. Okay, and the way this works is if I use my search promise, if it resolves, I'm going to go into the then, and I'm going to get results. Whatever those results are, this is just a variable name, so I could call this anything. I can call it search results, and I'm going to forward that on to a function definition. Okay, so I get those search results, and the search results come back as a fetched result. And if you look at the fetch API, really what has to happen is we know that this is some data that we want to work with, so we don't want to work with the raw data. We want that search results data set up as JSON. Okay, so we're going to convert it to JSON. When I convert it to JSON, what happens is basically I'm saying, okay, I don't want to deal with this search result right now. I want to work with it as JSON. I want to hand it down the chain to the next then. So usually what ends up happening is I'll return that first search result after I've converted it to JSON, which then forwards it on to this next then. At this point, I now have JSON data. And again, I'm making up an arbitrary variable name here to say, how am I going to refer to this data that I've now converted to JSON? So this is really my search results as a JSON object. That's what I'm calling JSON data. And I'm here, and I can process that data. And I can log it as JSON data. So I'm able to log that data. That's for when the search promise resolves properly. If it doesn't resolve properly, if it gets rejected, then we're going to go into this catch statement. And the catch statement, we're really catching some kind of error object, and we can log that error. Okay, this catch is a catch for when we can't resolve our result set. Okay, so now if I have my Atom Live server running, it looks like I do, I should be able to go over to my browser and see this. So I have my search terms, and I'm going to do a search for funny cats. And if I look at my network traffic, I want to make sure that it's all clear. And when I do this search, I'm actually going to go out to the Jiffy API. And you can see funny cats are embedded in the query string. And in the console, you can see that I'm getting that array of data. So my object is data. There's 10 records because I limited it to 10 records. And I can see the different records that I have. Okay, so if I look at the first record within my data, what I really want to do is I want to drill into the data, and I want to look at the images, and I really want a fixed height image so that they're all the same height, so that I can kind of lay them out okay. Okay, so I have this data, and some of you are thinking, you know, maybe I want to do this asynchronously with async and await. You can do that. That's perfectly acceptable. But what I want to do is I have the data that's getting logged right now, this JSON data. What I really want to do is I want to take that JSON data, and I have to kind of track into the data. So I want data, which is an array of items that I can then map over. So what I want to do is I want to go into the data, and I want to map over it. Okay, and I'm just making sure that I have the right case, so data is all lowercase. Data is an array of these objects that have a collection of images. So what I want to do is I want to map over all of the data, and I'm going to get a search result, one search result. That's of the 10, I'm getting one search result, and I want to do something with that search result. So specifically what I want to do with the search result is I want to go into the search result, and there's a collection of images in a search result. So now we're talking about one of these things, like index 0. That's our search result object. I want to go into the images collection, and I want to look for the fixed underscore height image. So I'm going to go into the images, and then I can either use fixed height, okay, and then look for the URL, or alternatively, a lot of times what you'll see is fixed height might be spaced like this. And this was kind of hinted at in one of the exam questions for the midterm, is can I refer to an attribute using dot notation or bracket notation? This is why you need to be able to use bracket notation, because if I had a space in any of the attributes, then I'm typically in JavaScript going to refer to that attribute using a space or using square bracket notation. But in this case, either way is okay because we have an underscore, we don't actually have a space. So all I'm going to do when I map over these results for this example is I'm going to log those results. Okay, and I'm going to get rid of the console.log of all of the JSON data. So now if I come back, I'm just looking for funny dogs. And it looks like search results is not defined on line 19. I have a search result, not search results plural. I just have one search result. Okay, so funny dogs. And you'll see that I'm getting these GIFs. And you'll see they all are 200.gif. So ultimately what's happening here is I have that 200 pixel height sized GIF for me to display. And at that point, like after I've mapped through this and I have the data that I want, it's my responsibility now to use some dynamic HTML. What I really want to do is I have the URL for my image. I want to build an image. I want to set the source attribute to this URL that we just grabbed, that we just logged. And then somehow I want to position the image on the page. And maybe I have over in my HTML a spot for the results. Okay, and that could be as simple as, let's actually build this out. So let's say I go ahead and I say I'm going to have a div with a class equal to results. And then inside the results, I want to place all these images. So I want to build an image. So document dot create element. So I'm creating an image. I'm going to set the source attribute. So image.source will equal this URL that I just logged. Okay, and then I'm going to position that image on the page. The way I'm going to position it on the page is I'm just going to append it to the results. Okay, so I'm going to, instead of looping through all of the results, I'm going to, outside of the loop, this is a little bit tricky, but when I do a map, I'm essentially looping through every element in the collection. So I don't want to search for the results every time inside of the map. I'm going to do that in the outside of the loop so that I only do the search once. So I'm going to say, okay, here's results equal to document.querySelector, and I'm looking for the results. And I'm going to use that then in the loop to append this child, which is going to be my image. Okay, so I do the search one time, and then I use it within the loop, and I'm calling this map a loop. Okay, so then I'm going to append the image every time. And then I can even do some kind of interesting stuff, like I might come through and I might say I want to have a link to an external style sheet. So style.css, and then inside of style.css, I might say that for the elements that show up in the results that are images, let's go ahead and set a border radius equal to 15 pixels so that we have those rounded borders for our images. Okay, so now if I come back over and I search for funny cats, cannot read append child of null. So I screwed something up here. It looks like the query selector for the results is causing a problem. I think it's a class instead of an ID. So let's try that again. Okay, and now we're getting our fixed height images for our cats. And if I did a search for funny dogs, okay, I'm just going to keep appending to the results. I never clear the old results. So I may want to set up a way to clear those existing results. And the way I'd clear the existing results is I just set the results inner HTML to an empty string. Okay, so I don't typically just remove all the elements. But you notice that I'm also getting the rounded corners because of the CSS that's getting applied to the dynamic HTML. Okay, so I have this animated GIF search result or search engine that's built on top of the Jiffy API. Okay, so this is kind of Project 4 in a nutshell, and feel free to go crazy with it and use it. But ultimately, the stuff that we've done in class is exactly what we're going to need to use in Project 4. And just to clarify a few things, some of you used this exact kind of model for Project 3. So Project 3 didn't require you to use promises, and it didn't require you to use map, reduce, filter, so those array methods where we're avoiding loops. Project 4 does require that. So if you, in your Project 4 code, have an XML HTTP request, it's going to be wrong. If you have a for loop for let I equal to 0, I less than results.length, so if you have that for loop in there, that's going to be wrong. You want to make sure that you're using the fetch API and you're using modern JavaScript with the array methods. So in our case, we used map here. Okay. So this is kind of a good starting point for Project 4, and I'm going to stop here for kind of this Project 4 intro.